Hello, my name is Rob Good, and welcome to Shit, I Have to Teach in 20 Minutes, a podcast for history teachers and anyone who wants a quick dose of history. We want to give a quick shout out to the National Council for History Education and thank them for sharing the podcast with their members. If you are enjoying the podcast, we hope you will also share the link with teachers and history enthusiasts in your community. In each episode, my colleague Eric Hahn and I interview a historian about their scholarship, asking them to identify the most important concepts they think teachers should share with their students about the topic for the day. We also include a free lesson plan, usually 2, that can be downloaded for free from the episode notes linked to this podcast. Eric, what are we learning about today?
Oh, you're going to do a deep dive here. In this episode, we're focusing on modern Latin American revolutions, that is in the 20th century. While there were many Latin American revolutions in the 1900s, it was sometimes difficult for students, my students anyway, to get the revolution straight. There are personalities involved, ideologies, not to mention locations. The revolutions were often fraught with bloodshed, fought for different reasons, attempts at reform. Again, students would have a difficult time keeping all that history, Mexico, Cuba, Nicaragua, among others, all that straight when it came to study for any assessments I was going to give. Rob?
Yeah, well, that's a huge challenge for both the teacher and clearly for the students. It kind of reminds me of what Craig Miller said in episode 4, that nobody can truly teach all of world history. But that being said, my guess is that there are some core concepts that can help teachers frame these revolutions for their students. Who's our guest today to help us better understand how to teach this topic?
Well, today, Rob, we have a true inspiration for me and for this podcast. We have Professor Stephen Hirsch from Washington University. He met with me some 15 or 20 years ago. I think he was actually teaching in Pennsylvania at the time, and was able to boil down Latin American neocolonialism in about 5 minutes. Not to confuse that with modern Latin American revolutions, but he offered a lesson that I've used repeatedly in my classroom since that time. Email us if you want me to share that with you. Stephen Hirsch is a historian of modern Latin America and with a specialization in Peruvian history. His research centers on anarchist movements and networks in Peru and their attendant trans-regional and transnational interactions, cross-fertilizations, and emancipatory struggles. In addition, his research also focuses on the discursive, class, gender, ethnic, and racial dimensions of the Peruvian opera party and Latin American populism. Maybe most importantly for us, he is an unknowing motivation for this podcast.
Well, welcome, Steve, and thank you for both inspiring this podcast and for joining us today. I'm going to start with our standard opening question, which is, what are the most important concepts that teachers should teach and students should learn about modern Latin American revolutions?
Well, thank you, Robert and Eric. I really appreciate this invitation. I think high school teachers should definitely offer some course classes, I should say, on 20th century modern Latin American revolutions, because they are so rich in thematic material. And in particular, they demonstrate that Latin American societies have persistently sought to overcome the legacies of neocolonialism, the persistent threats of imperialism, the problems of underdevelopment, social inequality, and poverty. And in other words, they have not been exactly, passive to these issues, but have sought to grapple with them. And ultimately, in a number of key cases, the Mexican Revolution, the Bolivian Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, Nicaraguan Revolution in particular, have taken the extreme, and I want to underscore that this is, rare, right? Where you have, armed struggle on the part of, popular sectors, multi-classes, who organize into a revolutionary movement in order to seize power, state power, to correct all of these social, economic, political, and even cultural types of problems. So I think it behooves the high school instructor to try to expose and introduce students to these to this issues, and to do it in a way that acknowledges that these revolutionary movements and social revolutions were part and parcel of global processes and interconnected with global processes in a whole host of ways which we can talk about. In other words, Latin America was not marginal, was not peripheral, cannot be sort of overlooked when we talk about 20th century revolutions like the Bolshevik Revolution or the Chinese Revolution or the Vietnam Revolution. I mean, Latin America was intimately bound up with these revolutions.
If you could make a link for us with, you just mentioned the Bolsheviks and China with Mao and Vietnam with Ho Chi Minh. What Latin American revolutions were inspired by those revolutions? Maybe in particular, I don't know how deep you want to get into the weeds, we don't have much time, but just as an example for secondary teachers.
Well, certainly there's a growing literature that demonstrates the cross-fertilization, for example, of the revolutionary movements in China and Vietnam with the Cuban case, as well as with the Central American cases, El Salvador and Nicaragua, and certainly sort of the flawed and failed revolutionary movements in Peru in the late 1970s and 80s. I'm referring to the Shining Path Maoist insurgency there, in which many of its founding members were in fact invited and paid for by the Chinese to be trained and indoctrinated in China during the Cultural Revolution in the mid-1960s. So you have those types of direct connections, but they're more indirect and oblique connections, where of course you have revolutionaries and leaders, as well as movements that were very familiar with these antecedent revolutionary examples, and that they analyzed them. They weighed the pros and cons of their various strategies, whether it's the strategy of a people's war or prolonged people's war, those types of guerrilla actions, versus the Che Guevara approach, which was a FOCO guerrilla war. So a cell strategy. These are some of the connections that one can draw.
So I have a follow-up question on that, because when you were talking about the Maoist influence with the Shining Path, and obviously we know of Cuban connections with Soviet Russia, but my guess is probably that these Latin American revolutions also shared out and exported ideas that influenced revolutionary struggles abroad, so that not only were they taking in these notions, but they were also, I kind of think about, for maybe instance, Cuba and Angola. Are there examples of how those Latin American revolutions were influential and important in a transnational space?
Well, certainly. I think the best case example, although it's not the only one, of course, as you mentioned, is the Cuban case, where Cuba literally shortly after the triumph of the revolution in 1959 was very explicitly committed to promoting national liberation struggles as a first stage towards achieving socialist revolution throughout Africa, as you say, in Algeria, the Congo, elsewhere. Of course, Che Guevara was instrumental in that. And all of this sort of was crystallized in the important, tricontinental, Congress of 1966, in which Castro himself was a, leader in trying to forge this alliance with former, colonized, nations and societies, and trying to promote, a type of, at that time, what was referred to as third world, solidarity and unity against imperialism. So, there is that, but I also think it's important, maybe even more so, to think about how the 20th century Latin American revolutions were informed by one another. In other words, the Mexican Revolution, if we take that as the first major social revolution in this hemisphere in 1910, that revolution was an important source of inspiration, but also crucial lessons for subsequent revolutionary movements in Latin America. And by the way, the Mexican revolutionary state, really established after 1917, actually did try to export its model of a corporativist type of revolutionary state, and it sent emissaries throughout Latin America to foster sort of the emulation of their revolution, and the same applies to of course, Bolivian, Cuban, and Central American revolutions. They all, I think, in one form or another, as some of these scholars have pointed out, provided important models that Latin American revolutionaries and movements were aware of. But I don't want, history, instructors at the high school level to get too bogged down, into the weeds, right? I do think it's important that they do make these regional as well as international connections, in part because, as I indicated previously, I do think it's important that that we don't reinforce the stereotype of Latin American societies as being particularly, more violent than other societies, or to essentialize Latin Americans as more violent, but to see them in terms of this larger global context in which they too are trying to, overcome, inequalities, asymmetries in power in their society. And I would also hasten to add, somewhat tangentially here, that all of these revolutions really are about seizing state power and using the state to transform the society, the economy, to inculcate a new type of morality and ethos, a revolutionary ethos in society. But that's not to say that all revolutionary movements in Latin America were focused on seizing state power. If you think about the Mexican Revolution, the very first major social revolution, the movement of the PLM, the Mexican Liberal Party, led by Ricardo Flores Magón and Emiliano Zapata, both of those movements, the latter being anarchist inflected, were not interested in seizing the state. We're not interested in dominating and controlling the country from a highly centralized, government in Mexico City. They were more interested in, a decentralized, self-governing, autonomous, community-centered model in their particular regions, whether it's northern Mexico or southern Mexico. So it is important to point out that the focus of the four social revolutions that I'm talking about, they were largely the product of vanguardist revolutionary movements that were aimed at seizing state power. So two things that need to be, I think, or I would advise history teachers to focus on is what the Eric Selbin, the political scientist, has described as the concepts of institutionalization and consolidation. That is, if we want to think about causes, processes, and outcomes and legacies of Latin American revolutions, he says, well, you can talk about when revolutionaries take power, they, one, dismantle the old order, and they simultaneously replace it with new governing institutions, right? This is the phase, the institutional phase of the revolution. Consolidation, which again overlaps with institutionalization, is sort of a subsequent phase in which the revolutionary state tries to persuade, inculcate, socialize the people to identify with the revolution such that coercion isn't necessary for them to effectively identify with the revolution. In other words, they internalize the ideals, the values, the beliefs, the principles of the revolution. And it's the successful revolution that achieves both of those, but they can be protracted processes. And not to complicate things any more, but it is important to note that anytime you do have revolutions, you also have counter-revolutions.
Okay.
And that there are opponents who don't necessarily, willingly accept their replacement by a new order. And that is another obstacle.
Yeah, that right. We'll stop with the contras. And
yes, or you can see this even more recently in the case of Venezuela and the anti-Chavista movements there.
Thank you. I am so sorry we don't have more time because this is going to be very helpful for secondary teachers, sage advice. Rob?
Yeah, thank you, Steve, once again for coming in and giving us some core concepts to take this very vast movement and to provide some clarity and also to make some connections in a global way and a regional way. So we appreciate that. And
thanks again.
Yeah.
Thank you, and any time.
Yeah, well, we may take you up on that.
Yeah, we may take you up on that. Right?
And remember, listeners, you can download your free lessons from the link provided in the episode notes. Be sure to stay tuned after this brief song to hear a description of those lessons.
Adios and hasta luego.
Ciao.
Oh no, the clock is ticking, 20 minutes, time is spinning, pulling facts from thin air, hope they think I came prepared.
Well, thank you again to Stephen Hirsch. That was amazing. Modern Latin American revolution is quite a large topic. There were some tough choices, and Rob and I grappled, not physically, but we debated about which topics we choose. And ultimately, he drew the wild card. I think he's going to be covering Cuba in his lesson. I thought that a less covered topic is the Nicaraguan Revolution. It starts way back with U.S. military bases in 1912, moves to the dictatorship of Somoza. And so what this lesson does is it asks students, it's really a cause and effect lesson. It asks students about the most important cause of the revolution. A timeline is given. Students can make their choices after some investigation. Hint, hint, my favorite cause might be the Somoza response to the 1972 earthquake. I think their response was really horrible and it just pushed people back into a corner, and they came out as revolutionaries under the Sandinistas. And then to close the lesson out, there are one effect as the counter-revolutionaries in the Iran-Contra affair. I think that's important for students to know under Reagan. And it's a pretty cursory. I know Steve is probably squirming at how little is being covered here, but these are high school students, high school teachers, middle school teachers, maybe even elementary teachers. But there are lots of interesting documents and recordings that students can explore to get a better idea of the topic. Rob, what do we have for Cuba?
Well, I've ever since I did my master's thesis on Cuba, I've been fascinated by it. I was really interested in Steve's comments about the impact of Cuban revolutionary ideology, both in Latin America and in the international context. And so the lesson focuses on Castro, and Steve, in a follow-up conversation, had mentioned that Castro's pretty flexible with his ideology. He kind of moves around from time to time. So the lesson asked students to analyze 5 different documents that Castro, either speeches or interviews with people, regarding should the revolution be exported. And interestingly enough, he's all over the place in those across about a decade and a half. Talking about whether it should be exported or not. The lesson also asks students to apply historical thinking skills, contextualization, looking at the author, and the audience and when it was done, close reading, and then I think really importantly, cooperation to see what happens across time. So at the end, students will make an evaluation. Was he more interested in revolution in Cuba itself as a nationalist? Was he interested in Latin America, or was he primarily interested in international affairs?
Did you have students analyze Castro's 4-hour address to the United Nations?
So I read it's the longest address ever given in the United Nations. And that's one of the, and that's really the challenge in dealing with Castro, because there's so much content to try and honestly represent him. And I think Steve sort of mentioned this in some follow-up conversation. It's really hard to do. I read the whole thing to try, and there's just no capturing it. Right. So, obviously teachers need excerpts that they can use. So I tried to be to do it with as much integrity as I possibly could. So yeah, 4 hours. Imagine. It's amazing. The speech is amazing.
All right. Thank you for listening. And remember, you can download the free lessons from the link provided in the episode notes. We'll try to attach some links to those documents we mentioned too. And please be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts and on Instagram and YouTube. Rob will tell you how.
Well, you can reach us for any feedback, questions, or suggestions you might have about the conversations or lessons at historyin20@gmail.com. And historyin20 is all spelled out. And please leave us a review. We would love to hear what you think about the show and share it with your friends.
Love it.
Yeah, we're even bad reviews. But we haven't had any. We need some critical feedback.
We need critical feedback.
Please.
Thanks a lot.
All right. Have a great day.
Have a great day. Have a great